Chapter 10. The Church in Germany. We got into church activity early. When Ronnie arrived in Germany, he immediately looked up the church leaders and found out where the church branch was meeting. He began right from the start to attend church. By the time we arrived in December 1959, he had already been called to teach the adult Sunday school class of about 65 members. They were meeting in the school auditorium when we arrived. Classrooms were used for various Sunday school, Relief Society, and primary children's classes. Later, we were able to use the base chapel and continued to do so as long as we remained at Hahn Air Base. I remember when the children and I arrived. Arnon Anton was the branch president. His counselors were Lawrence Olson and Harold Kern. Later, branch presidents were Dwayne Penrose Wright, who went on to become a full colonel. Next was James C. Collins, who died a few years later. I was not yet a member of the church when we arrived in Germany. Neither were the children, however, we all attended with Ronnie. Coffee was out. One of the first things I did when we arrived at our new residence was to make a good cup of coffee for Ronnie. He took one sip and spewed it out. He thought I had made him a cup of postum, but I had found coffee in the cupboard, which had been left there by the landlord when they moved from the house. I said to him, "You surely must be taking this religion seriously." He replied, "I surely do take it seriously. Don't ever make coffee for me." That was the last time I ever made coffee for him. The children and I joined church, with Ronnie. Ronnie never bothered me and the children about joining the church. He was very patient and understanding. He said, "You will want to join when you know that it is true." He was right, and no one ever asked me to join. So, after about 6 months, I began to get worried that no one was ever going to invite me to join. I finally invited myself and told Ronnie I was ready to be baptized. The children were ready also, so we set the date. And on the 18th of June 1960, about half the branch piled into cars, and we all drove down to Karlsruhe, where we found the baptismal font full and waiting for us. Deanie had already been defending the church even before she was baptized. A little Catholic friend during Lent season was so proud that she was giving up candy for the season and expressed her willingness to do so because her church was the true church. Little Deanie quickly corrected her and instructed her that our church was the true church. The little Catholic girl replied, "Well, there can't be two true churches." Deanie's reply to that remark was, "I didn't say there was." I can still visualize the two little girls hotly debating and defending their religion. Return to the old farm. It seemed that our whole lives revolved around the church during our stay in Germany. It was an exciting time for us. We traveled a lot and saw places that we had not seen before. Also, we took a trip back to Erding where Ronnie and I first met. We returned and visited the same farmhouse where I had been assigned just before my last assignment during the war. We knocked on the door, and a young lady came to the door. She was in her 20s, and I did not recognize her, but she recognized me immediately. The little 9-year-old girl. I quickly learned that she was the little 9-year-old daughter that was so friendly when I was with the family during the war. The family was so glad and surprised to see me again and to learn that I was still alive. The lady's brother, who had been so mean to me when I stayed with them, was not there when we visited. He was away on a trip, and I was relieved to know that he wasn't there. The rest of the family had been good to me, and of course I could no longer hate him. We visited for about an hour and departed, and we have not seen or corresponded with them since that time. Vacation at Lake Garda. Summers in Germany can be rather cool, So on 2 occasions we took off for warmer climates. One such trip was to the French Riviera. We took Rolf Reinert, a neighbor German boy, with us as an interpreter. He was about 16 years old and spoke French very well. We camped all over Germany during our trips. One trip was down to Italy. We set up camp on the shores of Lake Garda near Verona. We had a military installation in Verona, and we had access to the commissary and base exchange, so we visited there often. The family really loved our stay at Lake Garda. It was such a large, beautiful lake. We spent 8 wonderful days there, and on Sunday we travelled 65 miles to attend church in Venice. We found a military installation with an LDS branch, where we could attend all the necessary meetings and partake of the sacrament. At that time, there were no LDS branches in Italy, other than on American military bases. I remember also that we went with other members in the afternoon to hold a cottage meeting with a family several miles away. I was impressed with how the Italians closed up shop all throughout the city at noontime and stayed home for 2 hours, during which time everyone in town took a nap. Moved from Bernkastel Kues to Hahn Air Base. We lived in Bernkastel Kues on the Mosel River for 16 months and then moved on base at Hahn Air Base. Bernkastel Kues was such an impressive little town. One could spend hours and hours just window shopping from one quaint little shop to another. We certainly spent our share of time doing that. Our money went a long way in those days. The exchange rate was about 4.20 marks to $1, and prices were about 40% of what they were in the USA. So we could have things that we couldn't afford to buy back in the States. I will never forget our dear friends, the Joseph Reinert family. Joseph was an attorney and had a fine family. His son Rolf was a constant visitor at our house and was a fine lad. He was the one who acted as interpreter for us on our French Riviera trip. He grew up to be a lieutenant, colonel in the German Air Force, and piloted F-104 fighter aircraft. Both of his parents are now dead, and we haven't actually heard from Rolf for the past few years. We lived on the 3rd floor in the military apartment building complex at Hahn Air Base. We have fond memories of those days too. Mostly little villages surrounded Hahn Air Base, but we were only an hour away from cities such as Trier, Koblenz, Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Kaiserslautern, and a host of other lesser towns and cities. So we spent lots of time in those places, either shopping or just sightseeing. The German people were very kind to us and seemed to really respect the Americans. Even though we had beaten them in a very harsh war, we had helped them back on their feet, and I think they really respected us for that. Ronnie seemed to enjoy his job there at Hahn Air Base. I never knew exactly what he was doing, other than I knew he was in an advisory capacity concerning the Mace and Matador missile systems. These were medium-range missiles that could hit the Soviet Union from their locations near Hahn Air Base. Ronnie was an expert logistician and was to receive many other overseas assignments after this one because of his expertise in his field. Church was center of activities. The church was always the center for our activities, as I mentioned previously. Ronnie was ordained as an Elder 7th May 1961 by Elder Royal K. Hunt, the mission president. And we went to the Swiss temple to be sealed as a family on 20 May 1961. Ronnie served as a counselor in the branch presidency for the remainder of time at Hahn Air Base, and I was called as Relief Society president. Also, Ronnie was called to serve as a branch missionary under Elder Alvin R. Dyer. We both gained a great deal of experience and spiritual growth over the next several months while serving under President Dwayne Penrose Wright and later James C. Collins. Brother Collins died a few years ago and is no longer with us here in mortality. Brother Wright went on to become a full colonel and is now retired and lives in Texas. We have lost track of him and his family, but they might be in Waco, Texas. Assignment completed. Return to States. As all good things do come to pass, we found ourselves on our very first jet airplane, a Boeing 707. Winging our way back to the States in September 1961 after 2 wonderful years in Germany. It was as if we had been on a long vacation. And now it was coming to an end. Ronnie was returning to his home base at Robins Air Force Base, Warner Robins, Georgia, and we would all return to our home at 3880 Andrews Drive in Jefferson Hills, Macon, Georgia. It seemed good to be home with our many good friends and neighbors. However, we were not returning to our old church and friends there. Instead of Glenwood Hills Methodist Church, it would now be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at Beach and Patterson Streets, Macon, Georgia. The saints welcomed us with open arms, and it wasn't long until we were both called to serve in the Macon ward. Our old Methodist minister. Meanwhile, our old minister found out that we were back in town and decided to visit us. He had his sermon all prepared and proceeded to tell us how the Mormons didn't even believe in God and how disappointed he was that we, of all people, had chosen to follow after them. Well, of course, by that time Ronnie was already an elder in the church, and neither of us could be moved by such rhetoric. In a nice way, we assured him that he was getting nowhere fast, and that we knew that what we had done was the will of God. That ended the conversation, and he departed hurriedly. We never had any more trouble out of him. No one else from the Methodist Church ever came to visit us or try to reconvert us. However, the children kept asking if we couldn't just visit the old church some Sunday night so that they could visit old friends. We finally gave in and made a Sunday night visit, but that was the last time our children ever wanted to return. The preaching was so hellfire and brimstone and boring to the children that Deanie said upon exiting the building, "Mama, I thought he would never get through." Well, that was it for the Methodist Church. No more visits from us. I might add that we had written to our old minister months before our return from Germany and had told him all about our conversion to Mormonism, so we had not caught him by surprise. We had even asked him to read our letter from the pulpit so that the whole congregation might know. We never knew whether he did or not, but I understand that he spoke against the church from his pulpit from time to time. It seemed that all our close neighbors were Baptists, and even though it is known that Baptists were more likely to preach against the church from their pulpits, these neighbors seemed to love us just like they always did, and we loved them. Mrs. Gordy lived next door with her daughter, Margie and Francis J. Rooney, her son-in-law. She was in her 70s, and we were just the best of friends. I think she missed us most of all. She always felt close to us because Margie worked and was gone during the day, and I was home all during the day. So we visited each other often and could always talk over the fence. New friends found quickly in Mormon church. We quickly made new friends in the Macon ward of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Sister Lucille Bennett quickly became my best friend. Her husband, James Gordon Bennett, Jr. had just recently been baptized and quickly became close friends with Ronnie. It is really hard to single out friends as being the closest. There were the Armstrongs, Charles and Sis. Armstrong, who were very close to us. Also, The Bears, Alan and Mary, Carol D and Sis. Ussery, Eugene and Sandra Carroll, all close friends. Later, June Humphrey was to become so close and dear to me. There were so many others that I couldn't begin to list them all. I know that I have left someone out even now that would be very dear to me. Ronnie was called to be the adult Aaronic priesthood general secretary. Right away, after our return to the States. And then on the 10th of March, 1962, he was ordained a high priest by S. Dilworth Young and called to be second counselor to Bishop James Charles Armstrong. Carol D. Ussery was already the first counselor. I was called to teach the young Beehive girls in the MIA, Mutual Improvement Association. Also, I was involved in the Women's Relief Society, and at one point in time, I served as first counselor to the Relief Society president. Since Deanie had such a lovely voice and could direct the singing, she usually occupied that position in Sunday school and sometimes led the singing in sacrament services. Ron Jr. goes to college. It seemed that time was flying by so rapidly. In September 1963, at the young age of 16, Ronnie Jr. went off to attend school at Brigham Young University. He was a brilliant boy, but we feel it was an injustice to send him so far away from home at that young age. If we had it to do over, we would keep him around home for at least another year and send him to one of the local schools. As it was, we feel that he was never really satisfied at BYU. After 2 years at BYU, he wanted to quit and enter military service. We consented, and he entered the Air Force, where he was quickly chosen to enter the computer field. He had really wanted to go to Russian language school and become a translator. But because of his high test scores, he was needed in the computer program. One had to make high test scores of 95% and above in order to be considered for the Air Force's computer program. Ronnie Jr. averaged about 98% across the board on all tests given for entry into the Air Force. His IQ of 135 or better, and his reading capacity of in excess of 2,000 words per minute, left little doubt as to where he was supposed to fit in. The Air Force sent him to basic training in Texas then for some specialized training in California. His final assignment was at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, near Fort Walton. There he programmed missiles for space test shots. Ron Jr. was 18 when he entered military service, and because of the nature of his duties, he was never required to go to Vietnam, where the US military forces were engaged in a limited type, undeclared war, which of course you can read all about in the history books, and there is no need for me to try to explain here. Ronnie Jr. served in the Air Force for something less than 3 years, and was honorably discharged for return to Brigham Young University. In the meantime, our daughter Deanie had entered BYU in September 1965, just a month prior to her 18th birthday, on the 20th of October 1965. Her major was CDFR, or Child Development and Family Relations. It seemed only yesterday that she had her first date, and now she was in college. Deanie's first date, BYU mission. Our church doesn't encourage dating until the girl is age 16. Deanie was dating young Joe Nice, a handsome lad, for her first date. She was so excited and so beautiful. She was 5 feet 1 inch and very trim. She was beautiful. Her dates with Joe were short-lived, as there were so many other young suitors competing for her hand. She went to BYU for almost 4 years and felt the need to serve a mission for the church. She was sent to the Mission Training Center at Brigham Young University, where they put her through 8 weeks of German language training. She learned all her missionary discussions in German during her 8 weeks at the Mission Training Center, which is an unusual feat. When she arrived in Vienna, Austria, her assigned area, they assigned her to a companion that spoke no English. Therefore, she was compelled to use German immediately. She was enjoying a successful mission there. But due to a nagging back problem, they transferred her to California after only about 6 months into her mission, where she finished out her 2-year mission assignment. She returned home in March 1971 and lived with us until November, when she went back to Provo, Utah with plans to return to school at BYU. Since she had to wait for the next semester to begin, she found a temporary job, but while waiting, she ran into her old boyfriend, David Lyle Robinson. Now, instead of returning to school, they decided to get married. So in 1972, on February 11th, they were married. Their first baby, a boy named Jonathan, was born 3rd March 1973. He was the beginning of what is now 7, 2 boys and 5 girls. We will talk more about them as they are born. Ron Jr. returns from military service, meets girl. Let's return now to Ron Jr. before we get too far along. When he returned home from the Air Force, instead of returning to school right away, he decided to join a musical dance band and play music for a while. Ron was an excellent musician and played many different instruments, but he specialized in the bass guitar. He was also very able on the piano and organ. He found some time between jobs to attend Fort Valley State College at Fort Valley, Georgia, nearby. Ron would play for a while and go to school for a while. While playing for a season in Atlanta, Georgia, he met a young lady by the name of Diane Young. They seemed to hit it off just right. So they were married 30, January 1971. A baby boy, Samuel Earl Graybeal, was born to them 13 March 1972. Just 2 days after Ron and Diane were sealed to each other in the Salt Lake Temple. 11 March 1972. Diane was an inactive Baptist when Ron first met her, and was totally turned off on the subject of religion. But little by little she was won over when she saw that Mormonism was not what she envisioned religion to be. It seemed to have the ingredients that appealed to her. And we were not surprised when we found a Joseph Smith pamphlet on the table upon our return from a brief vacation in Florida. When I asked Diane about it, she replied that she had been reading it, and that the missionaries had given her the first 2 discussions while we were gone. We were thrilled for Diane, but we were even more thrilled at the thought of Ron Jr. becoming really active in the church again. After about 1 month, she was baptized by my husband, Ronnie Sr., on 7th March, 1971. Ron Jr. became active once again, and in the fall of 1971, he returned to BYU taking Diane with him. They went to the temple the following March when Diane became eligible to enter. Our move to the country. Before we get too far along, let's retrogress to September 1970. I had always loved country life and had often spoken to my husband about buying a few acres not too far from town. Well, we decided one day to drive out to Warner Robinson Perry, some 25 to 30 miles from Macon, Georgia, and just see what we could find that looked suitable to us. We stopped along the way and called a real estate agent in Perry, Georgia, and he informed us that he had a 10-acre place with a new house on it that he would like to show us. We agreed and drove out to meet him at exit 44 on East 75, south of Warner Robins, Georgia. We followed him out to Sandy Fur Road and then to 154 Herd Road, where we saw it. And it was love at first sight. We lost no time in selling our home at 3880 Andrews Drive, Macon, Georgia, and by January 10th, 1971, we had moved into our new home out in the country. We purchased a Jubilee Ford tractor and several implements, and we were ready to raise a garden. Our new place cost us $20,500, and we received $14,500 for our old place in Macon. We are talking about the year $1970 now, so don't be confused about the amounts. We would need to think in terms of perhaps about $80,000 in 1993 for the new home, and one must understand that homes were not as expensive in Georgia as in other parts of the United States. So, it was a good middle-class home, and we enjoyed it very much. Deanie returns from her mission, Ronnie Jr.'s wedding. We were living at 154 Herd Road when Deanie returned from her mission in March 1971, and also this was the house where Ron Jr. and Diane Young were married. Bishop Arthur Pearson performed the wedding, which was attended by her parents, Jack and Evelyn Young, her grandmother Young, and approximately 50 invited guests. My husband Ronnie was one of several who took pictures of the wedding that day, 30th January, 1971. The only difference was that Ronnie's camera had no film in it. We all got a good laugh, but it wouldn't have been so funny if we hadn't been able to get pictures from others who had film in their cameras. We loved our new home and made good use of the garden space. Ronnie bought some beehives, so we always had plenty of honey. This was at a period of time when the Vietnam War was still going on, so Ronnie was overseas a lot. This left me home alone for up to 3 months at a time on several occasions. But the extra money, and I couldn't complain. Thoughts of home in the Ukraine. It was also at this time that I began to think about trying to visit my family in the Ukraine. It had been almost 30 years since I had seen any of my people, although we had communicated over the past 16 years. My father and my youngest sister Ekaterina were still living, but I had learned that my oldest sister Maria and her little boy Adolf had been brutally murdered by a psychopath in 1948. My mother died in 1963. It was 13 years after I left home in 1943 before I finally made contact with my family in the Ukraine again, with exception of a short period of time while I was in custody of the Germans. I had finally lost contact with all of them due to the great confusion and uprooting of families in a wartime situation. After I came to the States, I feared even trying to contact them because of the harm that might come to them because of my marriage to an American. Olga Funk, my Russian friend, gave me courage. It was in 1956 when another Russian friend, Olga Funk, told me that she had been writing to her family and had heard back from them. This gave me the courage to try. So I wrote a letter to the last known address, and it was forwarded to the family in Konsky Razdory, to the north of their old address in Voskresenka. It was a joyful day when I finally received a letter from them. I learned that they had moved about 3,000 miles to the east. Some were in Tashkent after the war was over. Things were really bad around Voskresenka after the war. People were starving to death. The area was overflowing with people returning home from their wartime displacement, and there just was not enough food to go around. Transportation had been so disrupted by wartime bombing that food and other material needs could not be quickly moved from one area to another, so chaos resulted. My parents felt that things would be much better in Tashkent. So they braved all the problems entailed in such a move and packed up for the move. One can only envision the problems involved in trying to move 5 adults and 3 children for a distance of 3,000 miles by train at such a time in our history. There were my parents, my sister Maria and her 2 little boys, my sister Ekaterina and her husband Vladimir, and little daughter Larissa. Each had with them just what they could carry. The trip was long. Tashkent was a strange land to them, and I know there must have been much hardship before they were able to settle down and begin to resume a normal life. My sister Maria's tragedy. Maria had lost 2 husbands in the war, and it was in Tashkent where she met another potential husband. The family had been in Tashkent for 2 years when Maria met this man, and he pretended to be deeply in love with her and wanted to marry her. None of the family knew anything about him, but he claimed to be from the Ukraine, near where the family previously lived. He talked Maria into traveling back with him to his parents' home, where they would have a big wedding. But my family didn't feel that it was wise for her to go with him, as there was something about him that just didn't seem right. Ekaterina had already seen a hatchet that he had evidently been carrying and had accidentally dropped. Maria would not listen, as is often the case with trusting but inexperienced young people. So she and little 8-year-old Adolf departed with him. The whole family was worried when they hadn't heard from her for about 2 or 3 weeks. A letter was finally received from a friend back in the Ukraine, advising the family of the sad news that Maria and her little boy had been brutally murdered with a hatchet. The would-be groom was never found, but the Lord will judge him according to his fiendish works. My family was devastated. And immediately took what belongings they could carry and headed back to the Ukraine. Mother never got over the tragedy, and this very well could have brought on her early death. My sister, Ekaterina, said Mother would wail for long periods of time, almost every day. She had not heard from me in 13 years and thought I was dead. And now another daughter was dead. I know that her grief must have been terribly heavy to bear. These events were kept hidden from me until I visited Russia in September 1972. They told me about the deaths, but said they were hit and killed by a truck. Somehow they wanted to shield me from the gruesome details of their deaths, and perhaps this was best at that time. We had continued to correspond over the years from 1956 to 1972, when I felt it was time for me to try to visit the family in the Soviet Union. Time seemed right for a visit to USSR. Things just seemed right at that time. Richard Nixon was president of the United States, and we were on good terms with Russia's leaders, especially Brezhnev. The United States had been supplying Russia with hundreds of tons of wheat during 1971 and 1972, so they didn't want to do anything that would offend us and cut off their liberal supply of wheat. Even so, it still took me about 6 months to obtain a visa. Arrival in Moscow in customs line experience. On September 22nd, 1972, everything was in readiness. My people in the USSR had been notified and were anxious for my arrival after a 30-year absence. There must have been 300 people, mostly tourists, on the airplane, and it was a pleasant flight to Moscow. We arrived and started working our way through customs, and I should have known that you don't encounter Russian officials without experiencing a display of authority, and at least a little something bordering on the ridiculous. As I was awaiting my turn in the customs line, I noticed an old Russian lady standing by the customs desk, crying. I had met her in New York, where she said she had been visiting her sister. I know that they were delaying her so that they could harass her and make sure she didn't tell about all the good things she saw in New York. They have always tried to shield the citizenry from the outside world. My turn in line finally arrived, and I handed the customs official the form that I had filled out before we arrived. We had to list how much money, gold, and other such valuables we were carrying. As he looked at it, he asked for my passport and visa. All this time he spoke English to me, but after seeing that I was born in the USSR, and he immediately started to speak Russian. I told him I would rather speak English, but he demanded that I speak Russian. He asked if I had a Bible. I told him that I didn't. Then I showed him a book that I had been reading on the plane. He took it and flipped the pages and handed it back to me. He hadn't recognized that it was the Doctrine and Covenants, one of the 4 standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If he only knew that this book teaches of Jesus Christ just as much as the Bible, and is a book of latter-day revelations to our modern-day prophets. I wasn't about to tell him. The customs official said, "Line up your luggage right here on the table." I did as he instructed, and he walked up and stood by my luggage and looked me right in the eye and said, "If I find a Bible here, you will never see your family again." I knew that I didn't have a Bible, but I was still terrified. My mind flashed back to my youth, memories of next-door neighbors and others that I remembered being whisked away from their homes after midnight and carted off to Siberia or killed and never heard from again. My legs shook. I was so scared that I would have turned and went right back to New York at that very instant if it had been within my power. After that heroic act of harassment, he didn't even bother to look into my luggage. He must have either believed me or felt well satisfied that he had scared me out of my wits. I was relieved to get rid of him and go on to my next step, which was to register into the country. As I sat in the registrar's office and waited for what seemed like hours, I began to notice the difference in American people and Russian people. If I saw someone smiling, I knew automatically that he was an American. Russians seemed to have nothing to smile about. It might be different today, but then everything was serious business with them. Also, they seemed suspicious of everyone. I am sure they didn't trust each other, and for good reason. The Stalin era had taught them that you couldn't trust even your next-door neighbor. Thoughts had to be controlled and kept to oneself. Parents had to be careful what was said in front of their own children. This fear and mistrust still carries over to this very day and surely is responsible for much of the past misunderstanding between the American and Russian people. Followed by a KGB agent. My time in line finally came, and a young lady took care of me. I registered and she gave me instructions to take a bus into Moscow and stay overnight at a certain hotel. I was aware that I could be followed by KGB agents, and true to form, a well-dressed man at the airport seemed to be keeping me under surveillance. I noticed the same individual at the hotel after I had checked in. I began to understand that a Russian woman now married to an American and living in the USA as an American citizen was going to walk around in the city of Moscow unobserved. So I went to bed early that night. My hotel room was very small. The restroom was separate from my room and was shared by several occupants. Yet this was supposed to be a good hotel by Russian standards. I didn't sleep too well that night. There was an excessive amount of noise out in the hallway, due to people waiting in line for their turn at the bathroom. Also, I was still upset from my encounter with the customs agent. The night was long and I had to get up early to catch a plane to Zaporozhye, the nearest city to my family with an airport. There's that man again. I was up early and ready the next morning. As I waited for the elevator, I spotted the man from the airport again. I knew that he was going to watch me until I departed Moscow, so I decided to make him useful. Since I had just recently had an operation, I still was not very strong, so I needed help with my luggage. He was very polite and picked up my luggage and walked me straight to the place I needed to go without even asking me where I was going. He knew exactly where I needed to go. It was about 2 hours from Moscow to Zaporozhye. When I arrived, I was met immediately by 2 men and a woman. They pretended to be looking for a woman by another name, but it didn't look much like they were interested in looking for her after they found me. They were driving a car, so they were surely government officials, and they quickly took me exactly where I needed to go to register for that area. Again, I waited and waited to register, and then they asked if I wanted to continue on to Tokmak by bus or take a cab. I chose the cab because I felt it would be easier on me. So the in-tourist officials got a cab for me and bid me goodbye as my cab drove off with me. Everyone had completed his mission, and now I was in the hands of the next one in line, namely the cab driver. He was very friendly and talked a lot during the 60-mile trip to Tokmak. He had come 3 years earlier from East Germany to visit family and wasn't allowed to return at the time. He was still unhappy about it, but he seemed to be stuck there. I was a good listener, but careful not to talk too much, because one never knew if the person was a KGB agent or not. My sister Ekaterina fainted when she saw me. It was about 2 p.m. on the 23rd or 24th of September, 1972, when we arrived at my sister Ekaterina's house. The cab driver wanted to be sure that we were at the right place, so he got out and went to the door and asked if the family lived there, and then told them I was out in the taxicab. Then they all rushed out to greet me. Ekaterina fainted when she saw me. The excitement was just too much for her, but they all grabbed her and brought her to her feet. There was lots of hugging and kissing for the next several minutes, and you have never heard such chattering with everyone talking at the same time. Those who had met me outside were Ekaterina and her husband Vladimir, and then there was Tamara, Toma, my niece, and her husband Uri. Papa was completely blind, so he was waiting for me in the house. He cried and cried because he had wanted to see me again before he died. But some of those tears were just tears of joy, from just knowing that I had returned home, again, after more than 30 years' absence. We all looked a little older. We all looked and felt a little older after all those years. And I was seeing my sister's grown children for the first time. Her oldest was Larissa, born in Germany in 1944. She was married to Anatoly Pavluk, a captain in the Russian army, and they had a son about 10 years old, also named Anatoly after his father. My sister's second child, Valentine, was 22 years old, very handsome, and married to a lovely girl by the name of Luba. The third child was 19-year-old Toma, and she was married to Uri Ivanovich Semanko, and they had a little son by the name of Valek. It was such a joy to see all of them. The next 2.5 weeks found everyone home at night time, all wanting to hear more about the United States. They wanted to know how the American people treated me. I told them that the Americans had been so good to me and that I loved them as my own. They asked if my husband had a car. I told them that he did and that also my son and daughter had an automobile. They were really impressed and thought all Americans must be millionaires, except the black people. They had seen lots of propaganda about the blacks on their TV sets. It appeared that they were almost slaves to the white people. They would show black people living in huts and serving white people in their big mansions. I explained that everything shown on TV wasn't necessarily true, and that many blacks lived in nice homes and owned expensive automobiles. My sister and family lived in a very nice little house by Russian standards, But this doesn't mean that they had running water in the house. The little outhouse was still very much in use, and water had to be obtained by hand pump from the ground. But this was better than the old open well that was in use when I was a child. 7 adults in one house. There were 7 adults and 1 child living in my sister's house. Her son Valentine and his wife Luba lived there. Also Toma and her husband Uri and their little boy Valek. My 82-year-old father made the 7th adult in the family. All adults except Papa and Toma had to work. Toma was allowed by the government to remain home and take care of Papa, because he was old, blind, and only 1 leg. Otherwise, she would have had to work, and the little boy would have been placed in a daycare center. In spite of the crowded living conditions, there was some improvement in living standards since I was last there. But of course, anything would have been an improvement. At least they had bread and a little meat. Eggs and milk were expensive, and they couldn't really afford them, but they would buy some just for me. I told them that I could have all the eggs and milk or anything else I wanted to eat when I returned to the States. So they should not buy things just for me. They were so sweet to me. I discovered I had an American accent. My nieces and nephews would grab me and hug me and say, "Oh, Tyotia, Aunt Shira," nickname for Aleksandra. You speak Russian with an American accent. I never quite realized that I had developed an accent in my own mother tongue. However, I did know that I spoke English with a Russian accent. My sister Ekaterina asked me on the day of my arrival if I wanted to visit our mother's grave. So we had decided that we would all go to the cemetery next day. It was 5 or 6 miles out to the cemetery, so we took a bus. We stopped at my cousin Maria Denisenko's house along the way, and she served us a nice little snack. Then she and her husband Gregory went with us to the cemetery. When we arrived, my sister Ekaterina couldn't control her emotions. She fell on Mother's grave and wept as if Mother had died the day before. I tried to comfort her and explained that physical death was not the end, that Mother's spirit still lived, that only the body was dead, and that in due time we would see Mother again. You might imagine how confusing all this would be to my sister and the rest of the family, when they had always been taught that there was no such thing as God, and what I was saying was completely foreign to them. I had been in their shoes. I could well understand the thinking of my whole family at that moment, since I had once been in their shoes. My understanding of their feelings gave me an advantage in explaining these aspects of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I seized the opportunity to teach them as much as possible. But my brother-in-law, Vladimir, argued that airplanes had flown very high, and yet no one had ever reported seeing anything that looked like God, and no spirit beings had ever been sighted. I had to explain to Vladimir that spirit beings were made up of finer material and couldn't be seen by the natural eye. He seemed to get on to that idea immediately. He said, "Oh, made up of molecules, huh?" I replied, "Yes, that is right." I further compared a spirit being's makeup with the physical construction of air. I said we cannot see the air, yet we know of its presence when the wind hits us in the face. They all thought that made good sense. I explained to them that it was possible to see spirits, but that we usually do not see them except on special occasions. I told them that after we die, our body would sleep in the grave, but that our spirits would live on, and in due time would be reunited with the body, never to die again. I explained how God was our Heavenly Father, and that Jesus Christ, His Son, was the Savior, and that if we were righteous and obedient to the commandments of God, we would all be together again in the presence of our Heavenly Father. No religious freedom in the Soviet Union. We often talked about religion in the evening hours before bedtime. My sister once turned to Papa and asked him if he believed what I was saying. He replied that he believed it. I wasn't surprised, because both my parents lived before communism took over and outlawed religion. They had learned of Jesus Christ, but couldn't teach religion to the children. Such teachings could earn one a one-way ticket to Siberia with a guaranteed no-return trip. Remember, there was no religious freedom in Russia. Every night I prayed to the Lord that He would bless me to return to the States. I would never, under any circumstances, want to remain in Russia. As I traveled through the small cities, I saw no church buildings. There are churches only in large cities, and they are there basically for the tourists. They wanted to appear to have religious freedom. To the outside world, old people went to these city churches, but you usually did not see young people there. Not only would their peers look down on them, but the government would put pressure on them too. During my visit, my sister told me about a neighbor who had come home from Siberia about 2 years before. He had spent 25 years there for having a Bible and holding religious meetings in his home. After he came home, he began having religious meetings again. A friend of my sister attended some of his meetings and was really impressed, but her father was a communist official, and it is thought the word leaked out. Police soon invaded his house. Floors were ripped up, and the yard was dug up in an attempt to discover Bibles. They found a large amount of Bibles, so he was arrested and sent back to Siberia. Another friend of his, who had spent only 12 years in Siberia, was also arrested and sent back to Siberia. So, where was the religious freedom in Russia? Any resemblance to religious freedom was a complete sham. Many family, friends, and relatives came to see me. My sister and her husband Vladimir have many friends, and it seemed that they all wanted to come and meet me. Each one who visited brought me a little fruit or cake. They all wanted to know about America and the American people. Some of them complained about their own government. One lady got rather loud and indignant about how they were treated by the Soviet government. My sister told her that she should be careful because someone might hear her. The lady just got louder and said that would be just fine if they arrested her. She said, "Maybe if they sent me to Siberia, I could die a little sooner." One kind man and his wife brought me a large bowl of apples on my very last day there. I learned that he was head of the agricultural department for the whole state. He was a communist, of course, but my sister said that he was very kind and was probably the only man in town with an automobile and was a good man to know. When my father became ill, this man drove him to the hospital about 45 to 50 miles away. He asked if he could own a shoe store. One of the questions that this man asked me was if he could own his own shoe store if he were in America. I said, "Of course, you could have any business you want or as many shoe stores as you could afford." He looked at his wife and said, "See, honey, I told you so." He said, that was the way it was in Russia before the revolution. He told us that there is no incentive for the individual to want to get ahead under the present system. He illustrated what he meant by saying that a man could take a load of apples into the town market and sit there all day with no interest in whether he sold them or not. If he didn't sell them, he would simply dump them to the hogs, since the apples belonged to the government anyway, and were no concern of his. He was really impressed with the things I told him about our system in America. My sister said he was trustworthy and would keep a close mouth about our conversation. Nearing time for my departure. 2.5 weeks had now passed, and it was time to return to the United States. I hadn't seen all my cousins because they lived too far away, and traveling around to other areas was out of the question. One could not just go roaming around visiting people, even if they are relatives, unless it is properly cleared with the authorities. Did you ever try to get something cleared by Soviet authorities? My sister was afraid to even try to get our cousins to come to Tokmak. Bureaucratic problems would have been overwhelming. One does not appreciate freedom of travel until it is taken from him, and he finds that he is a prisoner, confined to a small designated area where he proves his right to be by showing his passport anytime asked for by local police. Vladimir, my brother-in-law, was ready to accompany me to the airport in Zaporozhye, but we had a lot of hugging and kissing to take care of first. Ukrainians are huggers and kissers. Tears were shed, and we all understood that some of us might never see each other again in this life. Perhaps I was the only one that really understood that this life would not be the end, and that actually we would all see each other again. If not in this life, then the next life. The pre-arranged taxi cab was waiting. We had to go, so amid the waving and tears we pulled away from the curb and was on our way to Zaporozhye. Our plan was to stop briefly in Zaporozhye and visit with my cousin Mitrofan Grushenko and his wife, who I would be meeting for the first time. Then we would go to my hotel and get me checked in. Then Vladimir would return and spend the night with Mitrofan and his wife. You will remember that Mitrofan was a general in the Russian army, where he spent about 45 years and was now retired. When we arrived at his apartment, he wasn't home, but his wife was there. She was his second wife. He and his first wife had divorced. We stayed as long as we could, but Mitrofan had not returned before we had to leave. Mitrofan received about the equivalent of $110 per month for his retirement, and his wife received about $98 as a retired schoolteacher. She was proud of her little apartment and spoke often of how wonderful the communist government was. I just didn't have the heart to tell her that our poor people in America had better and more elaborate apartments than hers. She was a nice lady, but years of communist indoctrination had blinded her to the reality of the failures of communism to provide properly for its citizens. A retired general in America lives quite well, and retired school teachers don't do too badly either. Vladimir accompanied me to my hotel, where I got checked in. Then he returned and spent the night with Mitrofan and his wife as planned. Next morning he met me back at the hotel, and we got a taxi cab to take us to the airport. He assisted me with my luggage and helped process me through until I was ready to board my plane. We said our goodbyes and went our separate ways. He is such a good man. Within 3 to 4 hours I was in Moscow, checking into the hotel there to spend another noisy night as people paraded back and forth from the communal bathrooms and toilets. I could hardly wait to get to the airport next morning. There were only a few people there when I arrived, so I was plenty early and had lots of time to sit and watch the people as they came in. I was thrilled when I heard my first couple, a man and wife, speaking English. I suddenly realized that for a few minutes I could hardly say a word in English. And this same thing had happened to me back in Zaporozhye when I heard a gentleman speaking English at the hotel. I wanted to say something and my mind was absolutely blank. For a fleeting moment, I was gripped with panic in both cases. Now I found myself following those two Americans and listening to them talk. After a few minutes, my brain converted back over from Russian to English, and to my great satisfaction, I found that I was just as conversant in English as ever, accent and all. I just had to tell the couple how happy I was to finally see some Americans. I found that they had been there with an organized tour and was now returning home. I was gripped with fear. However happy I might have been to see real live Americans, I was still extremely uneasy at the sight of so many uniformed guards and armed soldiers everywhere one turned. It was as if I thought I might be arrested and dragged off to prison just any minute. The memories of former years, and knowing what they could do to anyone just because they felt like it, was so embedded in my mind that a type of fear gripped me continually. I prayed to God that I would board that plane without any problems. Even after I was on the plane, there was still fear until we left the runway and was safely on our way. I was so relieved as we lifted off the runway that I thanked my Father in heaven right then to be returning home and for my safety while in the Soviet Union visiting my people. Except for the fear, the trip was wonderful. The misled news reporter. The first leg of our trip was a stop-off in London. As we travelled, I couldn't help but overhear a reporter who was elated over what he had seen in Russia. They had evidently led him and his group down the Primrose Path. He had seen lots of food, no food lines, good medical practices, religion practiced, churches open, and all those good things that the Soviets were capable of lining up for tourists and dignitaries. I could hardly wait to grab the reporter when we got off the plane in London. He listened intently while I straightened him out on each subject. He had not been outside the structured tourist trail that was established for his kind and meant to lead him to such conclusions as would be positive and favourable. I had been outside this structured trail and had seen the same old things that I knew about when I lived in the Soviet Union. There was no way that I was going to be taken in by the big lie of the Soviets, and I wanted that reporter to know the truth. We talked at length, and he seemed to believe and appeared to be appreciative of my efforts to correct his erroneous concepts. He thanked me as we parted, and prepared for reboarding for New York. Home, sweet home. Soon, we were airborne again, and were winging our way toward New York. As we stepped off the plane in New York, I felt like kissing the ground. You can't imagine just how much my appreciation for the United States had grown during my absence. I thanked my Heavenly Father over and over again for his protecting hand during my trip, and for returning me safely to this wonderful land. Ronnie met me in Atlanta and we drove home together. It was so good to be back with my dear husband again. Our children, Ronnie Jr. and Deanie, both lived in Utah. So as soon as we arrived home, I called them both so that they would know I arrived home safe and sound, even if a little tired. When I called my dear and close friend Lucille Bennett, she became excited and wanted the newspaper to know that I was home from Russia. It wasn't every day that someone made a trip to Russia from the Macon-Warner Robins area of Georgia. I was thinking of how wonderful it was to be able to use my bathroom again, and the many other modern conveniences that are just not available in the average Russian home. Maybe that's what I would tell the newspapers. We had to either sleep through the night undisturbed or get up and face the cold of the night as we made our way through the darkness, or light of the moon if we were lucky, to the little outhouse, about 30 yards from the house. And oh, how I longed for just one roll of soft toilet tissue. Can you imagine never having toilet tissue? Old newspapers will never replace good old American toilet tissue. After getting hit in the face with a blast of that cold September and October Russian air, one is wide awake when one returns from the outhouse trip. And when I get that much awake at night, it takes hours to get back to sleep. The phone rang 3 or 4 times before I could get to it. I had expected someone to call from one of the newspapers. It was Catherine Lee, a Macon Telegraph staff writer. She wanted to arrange for an interview, so we agreed that I would come to her office in the Macon News and Telegraph building next morning. I was awfully busy trying to catch up with my work around the house, and our garden was still growing and needed attention, but it seemed important to have the interview, so next morning I was there as promised. A nice-mannered but businesslike Catherine Lee quickly wrote shorthand as I answered her questions. The resultant newspaper article was dated 22nd October 1972, and it came out fairly factual, except that she had me on a ship at times when in reality I was on a train. Just a slight misunderstanding. The article was entitled, "Getting Back Home." Took 30 years and is quoted below. Getting Back Home took 30 years. By Catherine Lee. Macon News and Telegraph staff writer, published October 22, 1972. An American tourist on his way home after a trip to Russia was telling his playmates how impressed he was with what he had seen. The educational level of the Russian people, the quantity of merchandise in the stores, and most of all the great wealth of food as evidenced by the laden tables at which he had eaten. Mrs. Ronnie Graybeal of Kathleen, a passenger on the same plane, interrupted him. "You should have been with me." She then proceeded to tell those listening of her experience in her native Russia, where she had spent 3 weeks in the Ukraine with her sister and her family and her father. Her story was quite a different one. It was a tale of hardship and deprivation. A place where food is so scarce that the average family seldom sees an egg or a piece of meat. A place where there is no shortage of clothes in the stores, but where one item of apparel may cost a month's salary. A place where the reading of the Bible, if discovered, will result in arrest and imprisonment of the culprit. But Mrs. Graybeal's story of Russia really began almost 30 years ago, when as a young woman in 1943, she was taken prisoner by the Germans during World War II. She spent 3 months in the concentration camp, Dachau, and then was taken to a labor camp near Munich. "It wasn't pleasant," she says, "but I was fortunate. I was never sexually mistreated. In 1945, the good old Americans came and rescued her, along with the other prisoners. We were waiting to return to Russia," she went on, "but I got sick and had to go to the hospital, and when I was released, I found that the train had already left. So I was still waiting for transportation home when some of my prison mates who had left on the first train home returned to Germany and advised me not to go back home. Upon their return, they said they were arrested by the Russians and put back in prison there." So Mrs. Graybeal stayed in Germany, living in the home of a Polish woman she had met. Then in 1947, she married Ronnie Graybeal from West Virginia, stationed there with the U.S. Army. They moved to Macon, Georgia, in 1952 and lived at 3880 Andrews Drive for almost 20 years. They now live on 10 acres near Kathleen, Georgia, because they had always wanted to live in the country. Mrs. Graybeal says that she does organic gardening and had just set out a bucket of onions. The churches in her section of Russia were closed when Mrs. Graybeal was a little girl, so she grew up without any formal religious training. She and her husband are converts to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons. The Graybeals have 2 children, a son at Brigham Young University, Salt Lake City, actually Provo, Utah, and a daughter who works in Salt Lake City. Mrs. Graybeal had been thinking and planning for the trip to see her family for a long time. But something would always happen to stop her. Then last year she began preparations. It took almost a year to make all the arrangements. But Mrs. Graybeal says that there was no particular difficulty. In September, she flew to New York, then to London, and then to Moscow, where, she says, I would have turned around and come back home if I could have. The experience at customs almost ruined her trip. First, the officials made disparaging remarks to each other when they saw her American visa. Then one of them asked, "Do you have a Bible?" She said no. The official said, "Line up your luggage. If I find a Bible, you'll never see your family again." I was very shaky, scared stiff, Mrs. Graybeal said. Actually, he didn't go through all my luggage, just a few pieces. I think he knew I was too scared not to tell the truth. Her family lives about 1,000 miles from Moscow in the small town of Mulashinsk. Mrs. Graybeal is not sure of the English spelling of the name. Most of the 3 weeks was spent talking and catching up. Mrs. Graybeal's oldest sister died in 1948, and her mother died in 1963. Mrs. Graybeal described a typical meal of the family as consisting of soup with a bit of boiled cabbage and potato and a salad. No meat, no eggs, no milk. Of particular poignancy to her was the fact that her sister and brother-in-law would buy a bit of meat to put in her soup, only hers, or they would cook an egg for her and insist that she drink a glass of milk, which they had bought just for her. They were offering me their love in the egg and piece of meat, she says. I tried to tell them I did not want them to buy special things just for me. You know, I can have meat, milk, and eggs up to here, measuring with her hand up to her chin, when I am in the States. She explained that an egg costs 2 rubles, which is the equivalent of the salary for a day's work. Her sister showed her a thin, unlined raincoat for which she had paid 66 rubles. Her salary as a worker in a school cafeteria is only 60 rubles a month. Mrs. Graybeal had bought work pants, costing about $17 as gifts for her brother-in-law and father. While in Russia, she found some of comparable quality for about 30 rupees. She pointed out that they really know nothing about the United States. But they want to know. They asked so many questions. They did not even know that this country is sending them wheat. When I tell them that I have a car, my husband has a car, my son has a car, they think we are millionaires. They had never seen a Polaroid camera and were astounded when only a minute after snapping the picture, Mrs. Graybeal showed them the finished product. The position of religion is a precarious one. Mrs. Graybeal tells of an episode which happened just a few weeks ago in her hometown. A young woman confided in Mrs. Graybeal's sister that she had been going to a house where they are reading a book. It is the most wonderful book I ever heard. She went on to say that she had made a commitment to follow the teachings of that book, which was the Bible, but that if my father, a communist, ever finds out, he will kill me. Subsequently, the young woman was arrested and under duress confessed that she had participated in the religious study and gave the address of the house where the meetings were taking place. The government officials surrounded the house, dug up the yard, and tore up the floors before finding the books, among them a number of Bibles. The man who owned the house and was conducting the religious services was a Baptist. He had returned only 2 years previously after spending 25 years in Siberian prison for the same crime, that of teaching religious doctrine. For the second offense, however, he was given only 3 years imprisonment. So Mrs. Graybeal thinks that maybe the attitude toward religion may be changing a little. She also pointed out that during his trial, people came from as far as 500 miles away to protest, and that this was the first time that a large group had tried such a thing. Do the members of her family want to come to the States? And is there any possibility that they could? Mrs. Graybeal says yes to the first and no to the last of that question. She does think there is a possibility that her father may be permitted to come. He lost a leg in World War I and is now blind and old, and of no use to the government. So maybe they will let him come, she says. Glad to be back home. Oh, you just don't know. There's nothing like this beautiful country. End of article. Response from the article was immediate. So many people called for speaking engagements that I was busy speaking at clubs, churches and schools, etc., for many months afterwards. There were many special moments and events that trigger my thoughts, on occasion even today, that relate to those speaking engagements. I remember on one occasion the commanding general of Robins Air Force Base, Georgie, was to speak to the local Air Force Association. He couldn't be there that night because of an emergency of some kind, so I filled in for him. Where else but America could a Russian farm girl fill in for a military general on a speaking engagement to such an important body of men and women? It was great. I recall how on many occasions I would be asked to speak to some specific classroom of school children and end up speaking to the entire school with a filled auditorium. The children would sit spellbound as they heard a real-life Russian lady tell about life under communism as a child herself and how it was now, 1972 to 73. They were so interested and asked very intelligent questions afterwards. It was a thrill when they would come up and hug me after the meeting, sometimes with moist eyes resulting from tender hearts. I remember the Baptist Sunday School, where there must have been at least 250 to 300 children. Not a sound came from them as I spoke to them for at least 40 minutes. Their little eyes were glued on me. Their leader said he had never seen them so quiet and well behaved. They asked very good questions at the end of my talk. I spoke to a group of engineers, a branch of the Better Management Association at Robins Air Force Base, Warner Robins, Georgia. This was such an intelligent and responsive group of men. One of them, Richard W. Doubt, afterwards wrote a good article that appeared in the Macon Telegraph and News, included at the preface of this book. I'm also including other newspaper articles in the appendices. A little missionary work. Another time I spoke to a Baptist youth group in Perry, Georgia. As usual, after I clearly had them on my side, I explained how much the Lord Jesus Christ meant to me and my family, and how I had been converted to Him and His way of life, and that we were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly called Mormons. This always seemed to clear up any doubt that Mormons were Christian. After our meeting and we were on our way out to the automobile, the young lady who had been in charge of the whole event came up to us and informed us that she was going to join our church. Within a short time, she carried out her threat and today is numbered among the saints. Items of interest for religion in Russia. One item of interest, and always a subject of audience questions, was religion in Russia. As I have mentioned elsewhere, churches in Russia exist only where tourists are apt to travel. Mostly old people and tourists attend. The priest behind the pulpit is likely to be a KGB agent. There were religious organizations, especially Baptists, who operated underground. If there was freedom of religion in Russia, there would be no need for any group to operate underground. The state church in Russia has always been Russian Orthodox, and this is mostly what you would attend openly in Moscow. However, there is a little out-of-the-way church called the Central Baptist Church, which Ezra Taft Benson attended once in 1960 when he was Secretary of Agriculture and was on a trip to Russia. One story of his trip to Russia appeared in the Macon Herald, 30 November 1972, 12 years later. Tom Anderson, who wrote the article, traveled with him to Russia. Since Ezra Taft Benson is now the prophet and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I thought it might be appropriate to include a copy of the article as Appendix C. It is recommended reading. My father had looked so old and tired and sick when I visited him in 1972 that when I returned home, I wanted to arrange to have him brought to the States where he could get proper eye surgery. Ronnie agreed, and so we began the process. We knew that the Soviet consulate would not move very rapidly, so we were prepared to wait for as long as it took.